My name is Colm Kelleher. I was the project manager reporting to Robert Bigelow on Skinwalker Ranch starting in 1996, going on to about 2004. And then subsequently, I was the project manager, again reporting to Robert Bigelow, for the OSAP program, which was a government-funded Defense Intelligence Agency program that ran between 2008 and 2010, also associated with Skinwalker Ranch.
Colm, how did you and Mr. Bigelow find each other?
That goes all the way back in, 1996, like prehistoric times. I was in the National Jewish Center for Immunology. My background is in immunology and molecular biology. And I was reading Science Magazine, which is kind of one of the top tier journals. And on the job section, I saw this really bizarre ad. It was a full page ad or a half page ad, very expensive. And it was asking for scientists who were interested in exploring the evolution of consciousness in the universe, the origin and evolution of consciousness in the universe. And I'm thinking, this is Science Magazine. Normally you're asking for postdoctoral fellows in virology or whatever. And, here we have an ad in the middle of this that looked like a pretty expensive ad. And I just couldn't resist. It was such a bizarre ad in such a bizarre location. I picked up the phone and eventually I got to talk to Robert Bigelow, who said he was putting together a team of scientists and researchers to study UFOs. He came right out and said UFOs, and also survival of human consciousness after death. Two of the sort of big questions in the universe. What happens after we die, and are we alone? I mean, these are two kind of fundamental questions. So the telephone call floored me to the extent that next step was going out to Las Vegas for an interview, a job interview. I landed in Las Vegas when it was 117 degrees from Denver, Colorado, and I'd come from Ireland previously. I'd never experienced weather like that. Landed at 117 degrees. So that was a kind of like a baptism of fire. And so interviewed with Robert Bigelow, and he hired me. And then about a month later, I was on Skinwalker Ranch. He hired me in July of, when was it, 1996. He purchased the property in August of 1996. And within a month, the whole scientific study initiated within probably about 30 days of him buying that property. He doesn't, let the grass grow. He moves pretty quickly. So, I mean, there was a team of scientists. We started buying equipment. We started buying, sensor equipment, cameras, all kinds of recording devices, electromagnetic sensors, radioactivity. There's always this sort of alleged link between radioactivity and this phenomenon. So we had a lot of radioactivity sensors at the very beginning. So, I mean, within, I would say, a month, we were up and running. We were deployed on Skinwalker Ranch as a team. We had a PhD physicist with us. My background is in biology. We had a full-time veterinarian who was a DVM PhD. So not only was he a sort of a practicing veterinarian, but he also had a lot of research in pathology background. So he was on the property primarily to look into cattle mutilations. And the way that guy was able to conduct a necropsy, an autopsy of a dead cow was, it was like artistry. I mean, he could really go through a cow, take samples within an hour. It's kind of like a human autopsy, but actually in the field. And it was pretty impressive.
How many mutilated cows did you guys experience?
On the Skinwalker Ranch, we experienced, well, the family, the Gorman family, we call them the Gormans, had bought the property in late 1994, and then by the time we purchased the property, it was about August of 1996. So they were on the property for about 2 years, during which time they had about 80 head of really high-end purebred Angus. So, even losing one was a big deal. They lost 12 in about 2 years to a combination of cattle mutilations, finding the dead animal carved up in the pasture, and also probably about half of that number vanished. But I mean, economically, they just went out of business. They had no way of recovering from a head of 80 animals. They lost 12 roughly during that period. When we took over the property, we had about 30 head on the property as quote unquote bait, because we wanted to see what would happen. And we lost probably less than half a dozen, and then there was a few others disappeared. So throughout the whole period of, both the NIDS presence on Skinwalker Ranch and the prior owners, there was probably somewhere between 15 and 20 animals either mutilated or disappeared. And that's a huge number from a relatively small number of starting. I mean, that would put any rancher out of business. And the Gorman family were, they were shell shocked. I mean, when we actually drove onto the property, they were all living in this the small homestead that they had occupied, but they were all sleeping together in the same front room because they were terrified to be in their beds. They didn't know what was going to come through the walls or come at them. So they were, they were pretty shattered. Two teenage kids and then the two parents and the Gorman family. I mean, these were straight A students back in the day, but their grades went down the toilet during this period. They left the ranch, once we purchased the property, and within a year, their grades went back up to straight A's. I mean, it was like this sort of calamity had overtaken this family, and they were very happy to get off the property.
Did you do any research to see who owned the property and their experience before the Gormans?
Yes, we did. There was a well-known family in Salt Lake City called the Myers family, and they had owned the property for decades prior to the Gormans coming in and taking over. Prior to 1994 is when the Gormans moved on. About 7 years it had been abandoned. There was an old woman who had been on the property. Many of the other family members had died off of the Myers. So the property had been, empty for 7 years before this family moved on in 1994. And for whatever reason, whatever was on the property, we're still trying to figure out what that was, obviously did not want this family on the property, because all hell broke loose once they moved on the property, and they started losing animals, within a few months. And there was a lot of other stuff happening. There was, poltergeist activity. They saw several times they saw some, very large wolves that, there were no wolves in Utah officially since the early 1900s, and there were wolves on the property. Things like that. They also saw creatures, including, I think one of the teenagers did see a family of Bigfoot in the distance on the property. And, that's one of the things that we were following up on, both, the UFO phenomenon, and there were nuts and bolts objects seen on the Skinwalker Ranch, as well as a whole bunch of unusual creatures and also a lot of paranormal phenomena.
One more question about the past. Was there something in the deed about not digging on the property?
Yes, there was a clause in the real estate contract that the Gormans had, and they were told to notify the Myers family if ever there was an intent to dig on the property. And he did not know why that was. And we never found out exactly why that was either.
Did that ever hesitate or cause you hesitation in digging?
No, it didn't, because we once we purchased the property, that clause became null and void. We purchased the property under a completely different, I mean, it was free and clear. We purchased it from the Gorman family. We had no linkage with the previous owners at all. So we were not beholden to that clause. So we actually had we investigated that whole thing by digging on the property. And, we actually had a cat digger imported from Las Vegas. We drove it up on the back of a semi, and we had a Caterpillar digger digging in various locations on the property. And it was really interesting that anytime we went into a lot of deep digging on the property, invariably one of the neighbors would stop by and sort of report unusual activity in their location usually within 24, 48 hours after digging. So there was some kind of relationship between increases in activity and disturbing the sort of overall topography. And we think that might have been, when the Gormans moved 80 head of cattle onto the property, suddenly the whole place became noisy. It became very, very different from what it had been for the previous 7 years when it was abandoned. And, we think it's, if there are disturbances in the force, on the property, that usually triggered activity. We never could figure out why.
When the neighbors came to report unusual activity, what was that unusual activity?
Things like large basketball-sized orange shaped objects that would be flying around their property, orbs, but larger than the normal orbs. A lot of the orbs that were seen on Skinwalker Ranch, I've saw several of them, range between softball size, baseball size. These orange type orbs that were seen around Skinwalker Ranch in response to digging were usually basketball size.
Were you ever able to delineate what the different color orbs might have meant?
Only by experience. And that is, there were a variety of orbs over from the time the Gormans were on the property to all the way through. When the NIDS group sort of disengaged from Skinwalker Ranch probably around 2003, 2004. So during that 10-year period, there was a variety of shapes and sizes of orbs. There were white orbs that were routinely seen on the property. They seemed to be, flying around, mostly around the west end of the property. There were 2 homesteads on the west end of the property that we termed homestead number 2 and 3. And around homestead 2, there were quite a few. I saw, and pretty well everybody else on the property did see, these baseball-sized objects that would just kind of move through the trees. They would sometimes move into the homesteads. The only thing that they were analogous to would be some sort of drones that were just kind of moving around, surveillance drones kind of thing. The other type of orbs that we came across were blue orbs, and they were very, very different. I mean, they had effects that were, not to be encountered. I mean, before we got on the property, the Gormans ran into one of these orbs that started interacting with their dogs, and their dogs were very aggressive. This blue orb ended up, frying the three of their dogs, and the reason we knew that was that the sort of residue of these dogs, we actually saw it had happened several months before we had purchased the property, but we could still see the sort of the circular oval shaped dried grass and this sort of black greasy residue in the grass that had been rained on. And I mean, it was really not it was not in our interest to sort of go down the rabbit hole and sort of do a lot of DNA analysis, because it was kind of late in the game by the time we actually got to it. But blue orbs um, also interacted with the Gormans, and sort of from the outside, they felt a lot of, a lot of fear verging on terror. And it seemed to them that it was, for whatever reason, this blue orb that was hovering probably 12 feet away from the two of them as they stood outside the property, was beaming something at them that was causing extreme levels of fear in their body. That was the only way they could actually, interpret what was happening. Eventually, in order to break that spell, they put on a flashlight, and the thing dodged out of the way into the tree line, and immediately they stopped feeling this high level of fear. So, we speculated that these objects were capable of emitting something that interacted with the amygdala level in the brain that caused a lot of fear. It was speculative, but it seemed like from the Gorman family, they had a lot of problems with that. Blue orbs also, during the OSAP program, we had a lot of military people from the Defense Intelligence Agency who were on the property. I mean, they wanted to corroborate that there was something going on. They heard all these wild stories. So 5 different military people with combat experience were deployed on the property. All 5 of them had bizarre experiences. So they got the feedback in spades. 100% of these Defense Intelligence Agency operatives experienced in-your-face phenomena, including sort of feeling terror and feeling fear as part of the engagement with the phenomenon. But even weirder, when they all went home, all 5 of them went home to the East Coast where they lived, they had a lot of activity erupting in their households. Paranormal events, unusual sort of humanoid figures that would suddenly appear in the kids' bedrooms. I mean, it was kind of terrifying. Wine bottles flying off the shelves and sort of breaking on the wall. But one particular occasion, one of the guys who'd been on the property who had encountered this phenomenon on the property was out with his wife in, I think it was in Maryland or else Virginia, walking his dog like 9:30 at night, a couple of months after they got home. And moving through the neighborhood, they caught sight of this blue orb. And, it was like classic blue orb. It was the size of a baseball, moving silently about 10 feet above the ground. It moved quickly and grazed the wife's shoulder, and then moved down into the neighborhood and was gone behind the houses. But that woman was a marathon runner. She was in the tip-top, fitness, and she instantly, by the following morning, she had this severe headache. She had sort of flu symptoms, and her symptoms just kept on getting worse. Went to a whole bunch of different doctors, and eventually she got diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which it was called, which is an autoimmune disease that attacks the thyroid. But this extremely fit woman ended up, because of blue orbs, ended up with, sort of a long-term debilitating illness. I mean, obviously, she was no longer a marathon runner at that stage, but eventually she, over the years, she got better and better. We followed some of these people for months and months and years because we did document some medical injury cases in terms of close encounters with UFOs. And so we had 2 MD, PhD people on staff who were, physicians, specifically tasked to go out to whatever case was happening, and to, take blood samples, take, whatever was needed, according to these doctors, was done. So some of these people were followed for months and sometimes years. And so we accumulated a lot of data on the medical consequences of these close encounters. And that was one of the firsts, I think, in this field where you had we had a $22 million contract from the Defense Intelligence Agency that lasted 27 months. And so we had the luxury of being able to order up blood tests or, order up whatever tests that we felt was necessary or that our physicians felt was necessary. And that was a real sort of starting point, I think, for a future UFO program. I mean, we think that program was a good one.
You touched on something that you guys kind of made the moniker for in your books, the hitchhiker effect.
Right.
And apparently people went to the property, and it could be just guess,
Right.
and they left and they took something with them home.
Right.
So in the Bigfoot world, there's a theory that researchers that have been into the topic for a long period of time are marked somehow, because they'll go home hundreds or thousands of miles, and then the Bigfoot will find them later on and leave tracks in their front yard and things like that. So at Skinwalker Ranch, you had so many different things going on.
Right.
Was it just one entity controlling everything that was going on and hitchhiking and going home, or did each one have their own independent interests in you think?
Well, that's a very good question. And, I would say the final answer to that question is TBD. But, from the sort of the different phases that we encountered with the hitchhiker effect, one of the sort of characteristics was that the thing behaved like an infectious entity. My background is virology, immunology, so I naturally sort of gravitated towards this phenomenon because it was behaving like an infectious entity. So the primary sort of the index case was the person on the Skinwalker Ranch that got infected. That person then went home 2,000 or 3,000 miles to his or her family, or to their where they lived, and then it was actually the family rather than the index case that started seeing these phenomena. And in some cases we documented that neighbors started seeing, weird creatures outside their homes, blue orbs flying around the neighborhood. So it again, behaving like an infectious entity, went from the primary index case to the family, out into the neighborhood. And in one case we documented school kids, friends of the kids in the family, who also documented or reported weird stuff. Now remember, these kids were terrified of talking about this stuff because, they didn't want to look like they were crazy to their friends. So they did not mention any of this stuff. So the reports from their friends were independent of anything that they said. So there was this sort of chain reaction, and it did look like some kind of an infectious entity, but obviously it wasn't all the time causing autoimmune disease. It was only sporadically causing autoimmune disease. The primary sort of illness, if you want to look at it like that, was the eruption of paranormal phenomena. So from the Bigfoot angle, it's exactly the same thing. There's a sort of a sort of primary infection in a particular location. It may be that something attaches, or it may be that there's some sort of perception window is opened, where that person or people, once they get back, is able to influence the people in their surroundings, and then they start seeing things. They normally they would not be able to see this kind of thing. That's one hypothesis. That it is actually something that does attach.
So just so I make sure I get this right, so the person who's at the ranch, let's say it's you,
Right.
You're the carrier.
Correct.
You go out, you leave, and then that infects the neighborhood,
Right.
and you may not show any symptoms.
That's right. You may not see show any symptoms back home. This actually personally happened to me when I was on Skinwalker Ranch. I came home, my wife started talking. There's weird people walking through the bedroom in sort of 19th century garb. It was all sort of very innocuous stuff, but it only happened when I'd been on Skinwalker Ranch. And then it kind of faded away. It was very innocuous compared to some of the events that were happening, on the military people. For some reason, the military people had very, very intense experiences. Many of these people had been in Iraq and Afghanistan, so they were sort of combat hardened. And the level of fear that they felt interacting, three of them had this really wild experience on the property where it seemed like the fear level was being dialed up. And these guys had been in firefights. They knew what fear was. And this was beyond anything they had experienced.
Shifting gears slightly, I know the ranch is in the midst of a Native American reservation.
Right.
Aside from just that, is there a relationship between what was happening at the ranch and Native American heritage, culture?
Well, obviously, the whole Skinwalker sort of meme that has evolved out of Skinwalker Ranch did come out of the cultural background of the Ute tribe up in northeastern Utah. For example, one of the first things that we did was we started talking with some of the locals, and the Gorman family had actually talked with some of the local Utes also. And so they were told, the Gorman family were told, and we were told too, that there was a ridge on the northern end of the property that it's the property line. Just beyond the ridge is the property line, but that ridge was denoted in the Ute tribe as the path of the Skinwalker. And so this quote unquote Skinwalker used to walk along the top of the ridge or move along the top of the ridge. And this was the legend. Skinwalkers are absolutely to be avoided. And we were told, we had a irrigation system on the property. And, some of the tribe where it was, supposed to manage it and sort of work with it and all of that. But in terms of tribal members, it was a no-go area. The Skinwalker Ranch for a long, long time was absolutely forbidden to go on the property because of the path of the Skinwalker. So the legend of the Skinwalker was fully integrated into the property by the time we arrived there. And that legend originated from the Ute and, from the Navajo before that.
So when you were on the property, I read a story that you were there and almost like a dinosaur type creature walked past you.
Yeah. I mean, this was actually during the OSAP program, and there was a Marine, one of the 5 people from the Defense Intelligence Agency that was on the property to corroborate that there was anything going on. So she was on the property with myself, and Robert Bigelow was on the property too. So the 3 of us were walking around the property, and we were down in this area, this small pasture, which was abuts to what we used to call Homestead Number 2. And Robert Bigelow walked south, so he was probably 200 yards away. This other woman was probably about 30 yards away from me, and I was nearer the homestead. And it was like this cone of silence came down. It was like, people talk about the Oz effect. That's the only way I can relate it. But in the middle of this whole thing, this creature sort of walked by. It was like dark. It was like almost midnight. But it walked by. It was making no sound at all, and it looked like a large beaver. It had a large, what looked like a beaver tail, and then it had sort of spikes, small spikes on its back. But the weird thing about it was everything stopped. There were no insects buzzing. There were no There was no sounds in the environment. And this, creature sort of moved away, past our field of view, went around the side of Homestead to the side of the house, and sort of totally silently. And this thing, if we look at it sort of in hindsight, it might have been, I don't know, might have been about 150 pounds, I think. I mean, I'm just going from memory. But, it wasn't a huge thing, but it sort of motored around the house, completely ignoring us as if we weren't there, and moved down on the side of the house. So myself and this woman went down after it to see, because we wanted to activate our night vision equipment, because we were kind of frozen in this quote unquote Oz bubble while this thing walked past the house. We ran over, we couldn't find it. We yelled at Robert Bigelow, who was, about 150, 200 yards away. He came down, and the three of us searched the place minutely for probably 30 minutes trying to find this thing, and we couldn't find any evidence of it at all. But it was a really bizarre sort of, kind of feeling, because, like I said, everything went silent.
What time do you think that was?
About midnight, I think. It was 11. It was late at night, and it was completely dark. I mean, this whole area is out in the wilds. I mean, the nearest town is like small town Roosevelt is probably about 7 miles away. You can see sort of in the distance house lights from, homesteads a couple of miles away, but you're literally out in the middle of nowhere. And it's completely dark, and you can sort of, there's small amount of ambient light, so you could sort of see this thing, but I mean, it wasn't like seeing it here on the carpet.
Did it leave any tracks?
No, we looked.
So that Oz effect, how can you account for that?
I think there's, I mean, whatever is on the property is, I think there's very easy capability to induce temperature changes in the environment. It can, I think there's evidence that human perception can be manipulated under various circumstances. So we had direct evidence of that actually during that DIA program, when we had 5 or 6 people who were out as part of this program. They all had Generation 3 night vision binoculars, and suddenly behind Skinwalker Ridge, this kind of light popped up. It was obviously relatively close, and it just popped up behind the ridge. So they all sort of grabbed their night vision binoculars and they all looked at it. So, and they were all sort of transfixed by this, and this thing then disappeared. So we had a debriefing afterwards, and it was only during the debriefing that we got the information that everybody who had looked at this object saw something different. Some people saw it was like a square object. Some people saw a triangular object. Some people saw a round object. It was like all 6 people saw something completely different. And remember, we're looking at a light that's constant. You've got Generation 3 binoculars, state-of-the-art binoculars at the time. Light amplification technology, which is pretty constant. So, I mean, the only sort of variable in this whole thing was either the phenomenon itself or human perception as it was looking at, through the night vision binoculars. So we felt that was an example of perception being deliberately manipulated. And it was only later that we figured it out. After we debriefed these people, it was only later that we figured out that some kind of effect on human perception. And that's a very, I mean, if you go through the UFO literature especially, there's a lot of instances where 2 witnesses will report very, very different, I mean, dramatically different, and they're standing beside each other, and you're reporting like completely different incidents. It happened the same. Myself and this other physicist saw very different things. We were standing beside each other on the ranch. He had night vision binoculars. I did not, and he was reporting all this wild stuff. I couldn't see anything.
So you had some brilliant people on that property
Yeah,
as
we
part
had
of your
good
research
people.
team. Really good job. Did your team ever get together and think, you know, maybe they're studying us?
Well, there was definitely a sort of a cat and mouse game going on, and it was pretty obvious to us that whatever was on this property did not want to be hunted. We called our first book Hunt for the Skinwalker for a very good reason, because this family that was on the property were being terrorized by something that had the family at their mercy. I mean, it was manipulating their environment. It was causing things to happen all the time. And suddenly, everything flipped in July, August of 1996 when you got scientists who were on the property. We had sensors, we had surveillance equipment, we had, a lot of stuff. And we started hunting this thing. I mean, we were doing night walks. We stayed up all night, trying to track this stuff. So, I mean, the tables were turned, and this phenomenon became much more elusive. It was still detectable, but it was much more elusive, and very obviously did not want to be interacted with, or if it did want to interact, it wanted to interact only on its own terms. So, was it studying us? It may have been studying it. It certainly was a cat and mouse game where, we would set up shop because, one of our investigators would have an experience on a certain part of the property, and we would set up equipment to try to measure, the next day, because the whole thing was to get reproducible data, because that's the hallmark of the scientific method. And then it would turn out that, all of the activity had happened on the other end of the property. So it was like this constant cat and mouse game that was happening, where we would see transient phenomena, but it was always out of reach, and it was never the same thing. So the whole idea of scientific reproducibility just got thrown under the bus. I mean, there was no way that we could control the variables on that property because this phenomenon was in control. So, it could have been what this kind of psychological game of studying our reactions to, stuff that came out of nowhere, because everything that happened seemed like it happened for the first time, and it caught us unawares. And, no matter how much you train and no matter how many spare batteries you have, your batteries run out at exactly the wrong moment. You try to change your batteries, and those batteries lose power. So the whole thing becomes a sort of a cat and mouse game.
A few years ago, I was in Harrison Lake, British Columbia, filming a segment for Missing 411, The Hunted. And there was a shack on the lake that these people told me to go to, that the person might have had a relationship with this guy who went missing. I knock on the shack, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. I'm way out there. And this old prospector looking guy opens the door, and he goes, "David Paulides." I said, "Oh." It was kind of scary. And he goes, "Guess who was just here, Dave?" I go, "No, I don't know." He goes, "NIDS was here just a few years ago." I said, "You're kidding me." I later came back to you and I talked to you about it. And you said that you actually had some researchers that were working an area for Bigfoot evidence. And really, that was the first time I understood that you guys were interested in Bigfoot. Why was that?
Well, Bigfoot was one of these, I guess you would class it as an anomaly that seemed to show up. Like I had just mentioned earlier that one of the Gorman family had seen Bigfoot on the Skinwalker Ranch. There were multiple stories of Bigfoot being spotted around around Skinwalker Ranch by a lot of security officers. I mean, there was one famous case where we interviewed this security officer, who had it was a sort of a large area in the middle of the tribal headquarters, he had come upon this dog that was barking extremely weirdly in this sort of headquarters on the reservation. And he noticed that the dog was fixed, fixed in the attention. So he walked closer and closer and closer, and he started smelling this god awful smell. And standing in the sort of shadows was a Bigfoot. And it was like no more than sort of maybe 60 feet away from him. And the dog was inside the building, sort of as a guard dog inside the building, and it was barking like crazy at this Bigfoot. Bigfoot saw the security officer approaching and sort of vaulted across the wall in a very sort of athletic, very easy way. It was a relatively high wall, vaulted, and then ran straight down towards the village of Fort Duchesne, which is the headquarters of the Ute tribe. And sort of they had people running, looking at, trying to find it, chasing it. They couldn't find it, but like 2 days later, another security officer and his partner were driving near what's called Bottle Hollow Lake, which abuts Skinwalker Ranch. And as they turned the corner, their headlights picked up this large Bigfoot on the side of the road. It looked like it was eating something. And the headlights picked it up. It was basically in the middle of the headlights, and then it moved on. They moved on, and they stopped the car. By the time they got out of the car, it had run off. So we kept on bumping up against Bigfoot during the Skinwalker Ranch, the NIDS days, less so during the OSAP program at Skinwalker Ranch, which happened between 2008 and 2010. But, NIDS investigated multiple other locations. We spent a lot of time in Dulce, New Mexico, where we were very lucky to get into the tribal headquarters. We interviewed pretty well the entire tribal council, different times, different visits, and a lot of stories of Bigfoot from around Dulce, New Mexico. I mean, it seemed like metallic UFOs and Bigfoot seemed to show up all the time. So again, NIDS sort of encountered Bigfoot in the context of UFO investigations. We weren't looking for Bigfoot necessarily, but we also interacted a lot with a guy called Captain Keith Wolverton, who was a police captain up around Great Falls, Montana. And during the late 70s and 80s, when all kinds of UFO activity were literally buzzing Malmstrom Air Force Base, which was the home of the ICBMs, was part of the Northern Tier Defense part of the United States missile program. So in the middle of all of these UFOs that were buzzing Malmstrom Air Force Base, Wolverton and his team interacted with an enormous number of witnesses who documented Bigfoot. They documented all kinds of paranormal activity. They documented literally dozens of helicopters that seemed to arrive out of nowhere. Nobody could track them. And the Air Force Base were actually reaching out to Keith Wolverton and his team to figure out where these helicopters were coming from and where they were going, because the base had no idea why helicopters should be buzzing Malmstrom Air Force Base, and they could never nail it down. But, in the middle of all of this, there was Bigfoot. We spent some time in San Luis Valley in Colorado. Chris O'Brien has written a lot of books on that. But again, Bigfoot is sort of co-located in the middle of a lot of nuts and bolts UFO activity.
Okay, that's great. Now, when you were on the property on the ranch, there was a point where there was a light on a meadow, and the light slowly grew, and something came out.
Right.
Could you tell us about that?
That wasn't me personally. It was two investigators, and this happened. It was like in the middle of the real sort of frenzy of investigative activity. That we had people on the property 24/7 during that period. It
What would have
was
been the background of these guys?
They were both investigators. I mean, they were both part of the NIDS team.
Okay.
Um, So, this was about, I think it was about 2 a.m. They had been on the ridge, Skinwalker Ridge, overlooking Homestead 2, which is the place that I had talked about, had seen that weird creature, exactly that same place. So they were overlooking that place because a lot of activity had happened in that little pasture. So they were just sort of finishing up for the night. They were just, we're done. Nothing is happening here. They've been out for like 4 or 5 hours at this stage, and they were thinking it's time to head back to the east part of the ranch where the command and control center was. So one of them, at the very, just as they were packing up their equipment, one of them saw this sort of dull yellow light that was on the track on the ground. It was probably 150 feet below them. It was like yellowish, and they were saying, "Is that a reflection?" But there was no moon at the time for reflection, and they were trying to figure out what it was. And it seemed to be getting bigger, and it seemed to be getting brighter, and it was about. They figured it was about 3 or 4 feet off the ground. So they said, okay, well, we've got to investigate this. So they started unpacking their equipment again. One guy had night vision binoculars. He took out a pair of Generation 3 night vision binoculars. The other guy was looking at this, and it was expanding. It seemed like the diameter of this thing was expanding as they were looking at it. And then the guy with the night vision binoculars started really freaking out, because through the night vision binoculars, this guy was seeing something completely different from his partner who was standing beside him, just reporting this. This thing had reached about probably 6 feet in diameter now. It was a sort of a dull yellow light hovering above the track. I mean, it didn't seem to have any context. But through the night vision binoculars, this thing looked like a three-dimensional tunnel, brightly lit tunnel that it had depth to it. And, the guy beside him just couldn't see that. And he saw movement in the tunnel, and then slowly he began to realize, he started reporting this, that, there was something crawling through this tunnel. And at this stage, this guy was getting very sort of freaked out. And it crawled closer and closer and closer. And then he started reporting that this thing was climbing out of this three-dimensional tunnel. And what he described was like a large human type figure, maybe 6 feet, 6'5". No features, just black sort of head, black torso. Seemed like it was big, seemed like it was, heavily muscled. This thing crawled through, and remember, all the other guy could see was the sort of dull yellow light. He couldn't see anything of what was happening through the night vision binoculars. This creature, whatever it was, crawled through and actually maneuvered out of the tunnel onto the ground, stood up beside the tunnel, and moved quickly into the night, and couldn't be seen because it was black night. And then within kind of a few minutes, the diameter of this thing started decreasing. It slowly decreased, and the guy beside the guy with the night vision binoculars saw it decreasing also, and eventually it just kind of dissipated. But they were terrified because this huge, large creature had stepped out and had moved out into the night, and these two were marooned up on Skinwalker Ridge, over a mile away from the command and control center. So, they waited for 30 plus minutes. They couldn't see anything. They couldn't hear anything. Eventually, they climbed down from the top of the ridge with their equipment and slowly and cautiously made their way back to the command and control center.
Any tracks?
There were no tracks, no.
Any of the cameras pick up anything?
The only thing that was actually, no, the cameras were, this was outside, out of sight of the cameras, which was again what normally happened on the Skinwalker Ranch was that anytime the surveillance cameras were placed in a certain direction, pointing in a certain direction, inevitably all of the activity would happen outside the range of the camera. This was an example of that happening. The only thing that they could detect was this strong smell of sulfur. When they got down off the ridge, they went over to the location and they were looking to see if there were any tracks, anything that they could pick up at all. A strong smell of sulfur was the only thing they reported, and it sort of slowly dissipated over time too.
You know, in reviewing documents on portals, multi-dimensions, there seems to be a general thinking amongst theoretical physicists that these exist. Is that what your team saw?
You mean wormholes?
Wormholes.
Well, one of the people on the team was Eric Davis, who was probably a world authority on wormholes. He worked a lot with Hal Puthoff, who's also sort of done a lot of theoretical physics on so-called traversable wormholes. There's a long way between the theoretical physics associated with wormholes and then something opening up in the environment. I mean, the theoretical physics says that there's enormous amounts of energy is required in order to open up a wormhole throat. However, there's no evidence of where would that source of energy be on Skinwalker Ranch at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night when something like this happens. So, I mean, joining those two, sort of the observation with the theoretical physics is, without any sort of measurements, if there had been enormous fluctuations in energy, but I mean, the kinds of energy required to open up a wormhole is enormous. And to deploy that in the middle of the night with no other sort of, no other observations is tough. But, sooner or later, I think the more observables, the more people investigate these kinds of occurrences, particularly in a well-orchestrated, well-organized UFO program. And I mean, I guess from our perspective, the OSAP program that ran for the 2 years, we had a bunch of papers on traversable wormholes. We published what are called defense intelligence research documents, or a set of documents in the very highly classified network, the version of the internet that the Pentagon uses. So we commissioned a lot of these papers, and the object was exactly that, was to join what the best of the best could come up with in terms of theoretical physics with the actual observables regarding UFO phenomena, including, all of these weird things that were happening on Skinwalker Ranch that were associated. But, in order to marry those two, you've got to have an awful lot of observational data.
So what do you think Bigfoot is? Is it an ape or gorilla that moved over the Bering Sea in the Ice Age and came here from China? Or is it something else that we don't quite understand?
Well, like I said, the main sort of bumping up against Bigfoot that NIDS and we have done is always in the context with the UFO phenomenon. And there are multiple instances where they co-locate. So is there something? You mentioned wormholes, for example. is there some kind of bleed through that's happening with the UFO phenomenon as it moves into what we would call our reality? And is there a process where other creatures and other phenomena are kind of dragged through as collateral damage for, whatever happens with the UFO phenomenon as it moves through? It seems to correlate with an increase in paranormal activity. People see a lot of weird creatures, not only Bigfoot but other creatures too. So it's almost like a paranormal Disneyland that erupts when you've got a lot of UFO activity in the environment, and it could be quote unquote collateral damage. So we don't know is the bottom line. I mean, I know there have been plenty of attempts to gather, hair from Bigfoot, and trying to figure out if there's a way of tracking down, say, genomic analysis and all of that. But to my knowledge, there has been no definitive genomic analysis done that would be publishable in a mainstream scientific journal without, you know, without sort of criticism.
So several years ago, I brought Dr. Ketchum here to Las Vegas to meet you. And the idea was that you had published scientific papers in the past.
Right.
You could kind of lead her down that roadmap to success. And we eventually got the DNA. We got 104 samples, nuclear and mitochondrial. Did you review those results?
I looked at them, yeah. I think the main problem was that the most of the analysis that I looked at had been done kind of through the back door of research institutes. And the way to do this, and unfortunately it's not the easiest thing to accommodate, because most scientists would not touch Bigfoot hair. I mean, they just run the opposite direction.
Right.
Just like most veterinarians will never touch a cattle mutilation because it's bad for business. So that is the real problem.
Let me ask you: did we get good results? Did we get viable results?
Not to the extent that would be, I would say, that would survive intense scrutiny. And I hate that cliche, extraordinary, what is it? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yeah.
But, we are living in a world where that genomic analysis would have had to have every single aspect of it repeated endlessly, repeated from different labs. And, everything would have to be done absolutely 100% by the book. That was not the case in this. There was only one lab, or maybe two labs, but four
certified labs.
Yeah, but in terms of the full genomic analysis was not available for all four labs. To my knowledge, none of the four labs had the level of reproducibility that would be required. I mean, this whole thing of trying to get it published in Nature would have been extraordinary if Nature had finally accepted it. But it has to be 100% pristine. There were aspects of that that were not 100% pristine.
Had you ever seen DNA that came back, unknown male, female coming back to the Middle East? Had you ever seen that before?
The thing about, DNA analysis is that anomalies do crop up. Now, anomalies can be either, operator error, or they can be, and there's a whole slew of explanations. So anomalies occur for sure, and the way to circumvent anomalies is to endlessly reproduce. And again, I would be hesitant about making comments about that data, because I don't think it had been endlessly reproduced to the point where it was free of criticism.
One of the issues we had is just what you said earlier. Nobody wants to touch the topic.
No. I mean, that it's kind of like the reason that, 75 years after, or 76 years now after the Kenneth Arnold saw the UFO in June of 1947. I mean, here we are, and we have no idea of what kind of agenda the UFO phenomenon might have. We have, I mean, going back in history, I don't know when Bigfoot started appearing, but certainly, I mean, going back in history, there's endless anecdotal stories, but somehow these have never translated into full sort of scientific analysis. And the reason for that is because most people are terrified of their careers. You know, people who do sort of jump in with both feet, a good example is Dr. John Mack from Harvard University, who, he kind of committed to looking at these evidence of so-called abductions. But, I mean, they tried to fire him. This was a tenured professor, a Pulitzer Prize winner from Harvard University. You can't get much better than that. And I mean, their reaction to what he was doing was they tried to fire him.
What was the reason that the government shut down the program at the ranch?
Well, the government was, the program was an awful lot bigger than the ranch.
Mm.
But the main focus was, we were coming up with a lot of data on effects of UFOs on humans. Those effects of UFOs, they included, physiological effects. People, had physiological sequelae, medical injuries in some cases, psychological effects. People were having psychological effects and paranormal effects. So we, during the government program, submitted over 100 technical reports to the Defense Intelligence Agency in a 27-month program. That was an incredible amount of productivity. We had 50 full-time staff who were doing nothing else except investigating UFOs. So during the Defense Intelligence Agency, we submitted, like I said, 100 separate reports. Some of those reports did have effects of UFOs on humans, in addition to other reports having UFO performance effects, measuring speed, acceleration, etc. But some of those effects turned out to be paranormal. And, Skinwalker Ranch was a very good example of some of these paranormal effects. So it became a sort of, by the end of the program, people higher up in the Defense Intelligence Agency decided enough is enough. The greatest fear that they had was that this would appear on the front pages of the New York Times, which is exactly what happened in December of 2017 when the New York Times published and broke open the story of a secret program through the Defense Intelligence Agency. So, I mean, their worst fears were realized.
Last question. Was there a feeling amongst the researchers that this could have been related to demonic activity?
Not among the researchers, no. I mean, our researchers were basically handpicked. A lot of them had a lot of experience in the UFO phenomenon, but we do know through the intelligence community and through different levels in the Pentagon, there is a fundamentalist Christianity focus, where in some cases these phenomena are thought to be demonic. And we even heard phrases like, it is un-American to investigate these phenomena because of the demonic sort of ties.
Where'd you hear that from?
It came through a series of contractors that we were working with, that they had heard within the Pentagon.
Did that affect the study?
No. I mean, we were, 27 months isn't a very long period of time. So we were originally supposed to be a 5-year program, and we were terminated. But it was mostly for political reasons, because the UFO topic instills a lot of fear and concern in the Pentagon, where people are thinking that it will adversely affect their career. I mean, you see that time and time and time again. You know, the current organization, AARO, which is the Pentagon's official UFO office, you know, there's rumors going around as we speak that the head of the UFO AARO is leaving, and for good reason. I mean, this is not going to do anybody's career any good to be associated with the UFO topic if you're trying to climb the ladder through promotions at the Pentagon. Having UFOs on your resume is the last thing you want.